Hello, everyone. We're just going to give everyone a few minutes to kind of have some time to get into the meeting. So we'll start shortly. All right, so hello and welcome today to the webinar titled Introducing vSphere 8 Benefits for Small to Medium Businesses. My name is Hillary and I'll be your MC for this webinar. Thank you all for joining the conversation. Before we get started, let's cover some of the webinar functionalities first. So during the webinar, everyone's microphones will be muted, but we want this to be an open discussion. So please feel free to enter any of your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. There will also be a dedicated Q&A session after the presentation. Today's webinar is being recorded and a copy will be sent to all registrants by the end of the week. Joining us as a panelist, we have Ken Willard. Ken Willard is an ExitCertified senior instructor with background in VMware architecture, implementation, planning, and production rollouts. Specializes in system virtualization and consolidation, while also helping technology teams approach virtualization while considering the technical, operational, and organizational impact. So with that said, Ken, please take it away.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. So one of the things that we were kind of talking about with the release of vSphere 8, VMware's really put a lot of the emphasis, obviously, on a lot of the feature sets that tend to benefit really large enterprise scale sort of data center operations. And so we were having a bit of a conversation and thought about the bulk of the customers that we work with are either in the SMB space or the commercial space. And what were the things about vSphere 8 that were particularly compelling, or maybe even just potentially compelling for those audiences as we looked at technology and what was happening? And so it's kind of how this conversation got started, and that's how we got to this presentation. So as we're thinking about moving to vSphere 8, the starting point of this conversation, and frankly, if you've been able to participate in any of our prior discussions, you know that anytime there's a new release like this, we talk about and look at the upgrade path. Right, it's always a critical part of the conversation. So before we dig into some of the feature sets and some of the conversations about where we think the technology may be opening up opportunities for businesses and IT operations, we want to look a little bit about how we get there. So no great surprise, right? We know at this point that hopefully everybody is off of version 6.5 or version 6.7 of vSphere. Right, they've been out of general support for a while. We are now in a window that VMware calls the technical guidance portion, right? And really, what does that mean? And I had to kind of go look this one up to see exactly what VMware considered was and was not covered in that technical guidance window. And that is the idea that if we're in a technical guidance window, really what it boils down to is getting support and getting help there is going to come from you leveraging the support portal. And if you absolutely need to, you can open a support request, but it's going to be in a model of maybe some assistance around configuration issues and only in narrowly supported configurations to start with, right? So technical guidance, folks, honestly, at that point, it means you are primarily your own support engine. And we got there in October of last year. So unless you are in an unusual scenario where you have a custom support agreement that you're paying for. Hopefully, we're not still talking about 6.7 or 6.5 at this point. And I say that knowing that I know a lot of you are still faced with that, right? We had some interesting changes, particularly as we went into 6.7 and 7.0, where the ESXi installer began to enforce the chipset requirements for the installation, which made things a little different. And so folks that had planned for software upgrade budget, but did not have the luxury that in the same cycle, they were able to do hardware upgrade budget, you were sort of stuck, right? It put you in a situation where some of you may be still on 6.5 or 6.7 because of the hardware upgrade opportunities as well. So we know those are out there. Hopefully that doesn't affect a lot of you, right? Hopefully you are all at 7.0 or later at this point, right? We're 7.0 update 3 is the current release, unless something changed, and I have just come back from vacation, so I could have missed one. But we're good, right? If you're on 7.0, we've got coverage through 2025. So standard general support, good for another couple of years there. And then, of course, with vSphere 8 coming out recently, now we've got that clock sort of reset on support for vSphere 8. You can see the runway for that is out to 2027 for standard support on vSphere 8. So what if you're not already at vSphere 8, which we assume most of you are not at this point? We're still within sort of that almost first 6 months of the product release. And I know a lot of organizations won't adopt in that first 6-month window. They'll wait for a couple of updates to come out, then they'll start adopting the new version. So what are our upgrade opportunities? If you are an organization, obviously that's running 7.0, the most recent version, absolutely you're going to have an upgrade path there. And there is an upgrade path you can come from 6.7 directly to 8.0. But folks, unfortunately, if you are still running a 6.5 environment, you do not have a direct upgrade path for getting to version 8. Many of you may have been through this before. It doesn't mean you can't get to version 8. It just means it's going to be a 2-part process. You are going to have to first upgrade your 6.5 environment to a 6.7 or a 7.0, and then turn around and immediately start the process, or whenever you're ready then to start the process of upgrading onto 8.0. Right. So if you've got some of those 6.5 systems still in the environment, just be aware there is no one-step upgrade to get you to version 8. It's going to be a 2-part process. So thinking about getting to version 8, I started this conversation with the fact that I was really having some discussion with some other instructors, some folks in the technology industry, and what was it that was going to make this particular version and some of the changes in the feature sets interesting to the SMB or the commercial customer base. And so that conversation sort of went to, okay, what is it that's sort of different? We know different sizes of organization in those categorizations. Typically, it means different budget cycles and different budget sizes. But what are the business priorities? So we did a little bit of digging, a little bit of research, and candidly, these 3 priorities came from about 5 different reports and websites that we looked up. But these were common themes that all of the sources pulled from. And just so that you're aware, this included ZDNet, CIO Magazine, and a couple of others out there to try to see what was in the SMB space. Excuse me, a little bit of a sneeze snuck in there. And so these were themes that all of the SMB or commercial articles or research papers all sort of pulled together. Strengths and security. Well, okay, there's no new news there. We've been talking about that for the last decade. Now, what's maybe changed there, I think, is potentially the aggressiveness of things like crypto locker and crypto virus attacks that can infiltrate a system and hold your data at ransom. Those seem to be getting more and more aggressive. Again, generally they're focused still on the bigger entities because a bigger entity means a potential bigger payoff for the hackers. But we've seen some interesting attacks lately where they're targeting smaller customers, maybe in volume, and asking for smaller ransoms, thinking that it might be easier to pay than for those smaller customers to try to figure out some other solution. Obviously, optimization, right? Saving money and saving time in IT operations. Again, not a particularly new theme there, but it made our list because it was occurring in multiple ones of these articles. And I think there's kind of some interesting feature releases with version 8 of vSphere that fit into that priority very nicely. And the last of these three was kind of interesting. To be candid, of the business priorities that we found, this last one is the one that I think is maybe the biggest stretch. It's the one that we've probably got the longest runway or the longest horizon on. Start using data insights to guide the business. Okay, well, what are we really talking about here? Well, in my mind, what this starts to hint towards is this idea of more and more businesses starting to try to find some way to leverage things like machine learning to analyze customer patterns, analyze order histories, and maybe do cross-sells or upsells and those types of things, or maybe even leveraging those types of analytic tools to plan for forecasting and inventory numbers and those types of things. The reason I say I feel like this one's maybe the one with the longest runway is generally we're seeing those types of applications require some specialty processors, some specialty hardware. But the reason I think that it's of interest in this conversation is what I think we're going to see. And to be candid, this is speculation. I don't know what the software teams are going to do. But I think we're going to see more and more different types of software platforms that have these types of machine learning analytic capabilities just built in from the start. It is a trend that we are seeing growing in the software industry. So being able to leverage those in whatever piece of software you're using to run your accounting package or your inventory planning and your warehouse management package and those types of things, I think we'll see those capabilities built into more and more software stacks as we go forward. So these were kind of the things that the team and I pulled together to have the conversation. So let's think about vSphere 8 and how does it really start to leverage those and tie into those three priorities. Folks, if you've already read anything about vSphere 8, if you've already looked at any of the VMware materials around vSphere 8, you know that I frankly borrowed this right from one of their presentation decks. If this is the message that VMware is going to market around vSphere 8. So which ones of these do I think really start to tie in? Cloud benefits on premises, maybe. I think, frankly, the SMB and the commercial spaces are going to continue to leverage more and more hybrid cloud architectures. So maybe a little bit of that. Supercharging workload performance. Yeah, this is the one actually that we were just talking about. This is this idea of machine learning or advanced analytics being able to be leveraged in different pieces of software. And when we think about some of the things that we can do in vSphere 8 to manage those throughput behaviors, to leverage a new technology that we're going to talk about on the next slide called a DPU. Yeah, I think that's one of the bullets that lines up very nicely between business priorities and what vSphere 8 offers. Enhancing operational efficiency. Yes, I think that's a big one. We're going to talk about some of the lifecycle management features that are new in version 8 that I think, I don't care if you're a massive enterprise with 8 data centers around the world, or if you're an SMB shop with 3 servers in your data center. I think there's some operational efficiencies that are really, really valuable here. And then finally, accelerating innovation for DevOps. This is another one of those that I think may have kind of a long runway benefit for the SMB space. When we think about what's happening with DevOps, when we think about the move to container-based applications, this was has been a big topic, particularly for those organizations that produce really kind of elaborate, big websites and those kinds of things. But what we're seeing is commercial off-the-shelf software is starting to leverage a container-based architecture as well. And so the reason I think that maybe this accelerated innovation for DevOps has some alignment to the SMB and the commercial spaces is because we are going to see that fold into commercial off-the-shelf software products. Pardon me, my team got busy here this morning, and I didn't realize they had one of my devices that was not already on mute. So let's start digging into some of these new technologies, and we're going to dig right into this, supercharge the workload performance right off the bat here. So data processing units, mentioned that as we were kind of talking through this. This is something that we've been hearing more and more about, especially when I think about the last, let's say, 2, maybe 3 VMworld or VM Explorer events, depending on which one of those you were able to attend. Folks, today, this really boils down to, it is a specialty hardware card. We've been seeing this a lot in the hyperscalers. When you think about organizations like Google Cloud and Azure and Amazon Web Services, they have been leveraging this type of specialty card or purpose function card to optimize their operations for years. And we're now seeing this start to move into the on-premises data center as well. So when we think about it, what is a data processing unit? Well, it's a programmable card. That's really all it boils down to. Now, in this case, you see we've got a sort of a particular illustration here of one that is intended to drive network traffic. See, this one's architected with a couple of high-speed internet interfaces and a traditional out-of-band management sort of interface. And this basically gives us this idea of a system on a chip. And VMware's been working on this for years. If you've read about their Project Monterey program, this is really what Project Monterey was all about. It is this idea that we can offload functions that the hypervisor used to manage to the hardware. And we all know that when you move functions out of the software stack and into the hardware stack, they get faster, right? That's one of the reasons that we have specialty function cards and things like GPUs, graphics processing units, is because when you move out of the software stack into the hardware stack, the operations get faster. The other thing with the ability to leverage a DPU in a virtualized environment is now I've taken compute resource off of that traditional CPU and giving it over to a dedicated card. And you can read, there's a lot of statistics, there's a lot of different analytics out there, but they say if you think about it today, we use up to, depending on the study, 30% of your traditional CPU is based in running either network or security practices or security software in a traditional environment. It means 30% of my CPU is dedicated to stuff that's not my core business in a way. It's 30% of my CPU that I can't use to run my inventory management, my accounting and billing software, all of those types of things. When I offload those network functions and security functions to a DPU, I now free up that traditional processor to go back to do other work for the rest of my applications. Right, so what do we see? We've been talking about this for a while. Traditionally, the way this worked was you had your generalized hypervisor, and it was responsible for managing the compute resources to my VMs. That's how I did my host management. You know that if you've done much reading, when we leverage things like NSX installs some, well, I just lost the thought process for a moment. NSX installs some additional kernel components into that hypervisor, right? So all of these types of things used to run at the hypervisor level. And this is where then that kind of 30% overhead number starts to get generated. When we add this idea of a GPU to the model, I can now move all of those functions down into the dedicated DPU architecture. And now what's interesting, I want to point this out on this slide because I think this is a really interesting detail. We now have ESX identified as running, let's call it on the core host. I also have an instance of ESXi running on that DPU card. Right, the DPUs have ARM chips on them. You know, a couple of years back, VMware announced ARM support for ESXi. This is kind of what we've been working up to. So with vSphere 8 general availability, the architecture now supports moving NSX networking and security services onto the DPU. Couple of things there, right? We get faster, better performance in that model. And we're now freeing up that compute resource in the core CPU, your Intel or AMD based processor, to go back to running your application workloads. And that's what we have today in GA. And what we know is coming, right? VMware is building up to this. We are going to see over the next several evolutions of ESXi, more and more services offloaded or be able to be offloaded into those DPUs. So we will pick up better performance and free up that compute resource for our core virtual machines to run on. And one of the really nice things about this is with a version of ESXi effectively running in two different places in each host today, Lifecycle Manager is already aware of that model and is able to keep the two different versions in lockstep. So when you upgrade a host that has a DPU in it, Lifecycle Manager understands that and is able to keep those two versions of ESXi properly coordinated. So that's one of those things, we're kind of right on the leading edge of it. The technologies, like I said, we've been talking about Project Monterey for a while, but today we have the general availability support for NSX, network and security services. We're going to see the other services coming along for DPU offload as well. And so from an SMB or commercial customer standpoint, do I think this is something you're rushing out to adopt today? Probably not. But I do think it's worth maybe getting into your thought processes today. And as you look at your next hardware refresh cycle, do you want to maybe consider speccing in some of these DPU cards into those new hosts so that you can leverage these services? Yeah, I think that's probably a good investment, right? So something to think about as your hardware refresh budgets come up. The other thing that we've seen that's probably, frankly, more in the commercial space than necessarily the SMB space, but this is this idea of we are needing to run bigger and bigger VMs, especially when we think about things like inventory and logistics management systems that we see a lot of the customers, that's their core business. One of the things that's interesting is when you get those bigger and bigger VMs, we get into what's called non-uniform memory access models. The idea here is, and if you've opened the case on a computer lately, you know that you have, if we think about a traditional two-socket motherboard, you'll have the two sockets, and then physically associated with each socket, we'll have banks of memory. And sometimes with some of these ERP systems, or candidly, more often, the databases that back the ERP or the shipping and logistics systems, they need more memory for the VM than exists in a single side of that motherboard, right? In a single memory bank. When that happens, that's what we call a wide VM. It's going to use memory resource on both sides of the motherboard. Well, for it to do that, there's actually some performance penalties if it's not done effectively and correctly in the coding. So when we think about this non-uniform memory access, it's becoming more and more common, particularly in things like SQL and Oracle databases and some of these larger asset management, logistics management applications. And it used to be a little bit of a pain, candidly. You had to enable vNUMA, and then you had to go into the virtual machine's advanced configurations and add individual advanced line items to set the configuration the way you wanted it to be. Well, now this is really nice. As you can see here, we're now editing the virtual machine options for a particular VM. And I can go in and right in the graphic interface, configure this non-uniform memory access configuration. So I can determine my CPU architecture and the memory placement architecture for this particular VM right in the graphic interface. And from an ongoing administration process, maybe you didn't do the configuration of the VM. It's now going to have, we're going to have a new panel or widget, as they're called in the user interface, which shows us the CPU topology. So if we have a vNUMA enabled virtual machine, but we didn't configure it, it'll be very easy for us to look at the summary page for that VM and figure out how it's configured. So vNUMA is sort of thinking about performance and management optimization. Lost my grasp of English for a minute. Performance and management optimization on the single VM scale. The other tool that we've had for years in the product is the distributed resource scheduler. But we know that piece of code saw a major refresh in version 7. We went from a very host and cluster aligned management model to an individual virtual machine aligned management model in 7.0. Well, in 8, that's been taken a step further. With 7.0, we were looking at the individual VM and particularly what was called memory monitoring and remediation. Now with version 8, we've built out on that memory monitoring and remediation capability for those of you that have applications that are using what's called persistent memory. That is dedicated memory that's very close to the CPU and applied for a particular VM. We can now take persistent memory VMs into the DRS decision-making process and make sure that we are optimizing the overall placement decisions to best suit every tailored VM configuration. Again, not something that all of you are going to be running into, but certainly those of you that are running larger applications, larger VMs, you may be leveraging this persistent memory architecture. And DRS now is aware of that configuration for VMs. And then there's actually a bunch of other sort of things that came along that are very virtual machine focused improvements in vSphere 8. So we get a new virtual hardware version. Version 20 was released with vSphere 8. It gets us support for the newest CPUs, and it gets us some really interesting new features that we're going to talk about here. Device virtualization extensions, one of the cool ones. We've got a slide coming up on that. We also start to get application-aware migrations. That's a big deal. If any of you have ever had an application that didn't respond well, I think is the polite way to say that, that didn't respond well when you needed to do a vMotion migration, well, we're getting some ways to start to handle that. And then the other sort of an interesting thing is better and broader support for multiple GPUs if you need that. Again, we go back to analytics. I think we're seeing more and more demand for GPU support. So we're getting enhanced support there. So just some really nice additional features. Let's start breaking some of these down. This idea of what they're calling the device virtualization extensions. A feature set that we've had in the product for years is what's called direct path IO. It basically gives us the ability to take a PCIe device and give it directly to a virtual machine. And there's lots of reasons we might want to do that. Improved performance, or just dedicated communication path. Let's say the device we were giving over was a network card of some kind, right? We've had this ability for the past 6-8 years, I think, was when direct path IO was kind of introduced. But the downside to direct path IO was you absolutely could not vMotion migrate that VM, because it needed that exact specific hardware card in that exact specific host. So it really limited your management and maintenance functions. With this idea of device virtualization extensions, now it's going to take the market a little bit to catch up with this, but we can now have the hardware vendors leverage this new extension, this new virtual hardware device type. And through a series of APIs, then we can now vMotion migrate a VM that's actually using a dedicated hardware card in the host, right? That is the idea of the device virtualization extension. Now, that is not something that VMware can do by itself. This requires the participation of the various hardware vendors. So we're not going to have a bunch of this available to us right away. It's going to take the industry some time to get caught up to this, but the capability's there, right? So it'll give us the ability to have much better control when it's time to either live migrate a VM, or the other big one, when we need to do disk and memory snapshots of a VM. Disk and memory snapshots sometimes do not work well with those PCIe direct IO mapped devices. So this will help us have much better support for those functions, as well as when we think about doing things like DRS, rebalancing our workloads, or high availability services being able to restart VMs in the event of a host failure. This is going to give us much greater control. The other thing that's very virtual machine focused is we now have this idea of being able to create application aware migrations. This is another one of those things that VMware can't do this by themselves. The application vendors are going to need to participate in this process. But what it gives us the ability to do is, we all know that there are sometimes applications that don't go through a live migration very gracefully. There is a process in a vMotion migration called the stun process. It is the very last component of moving a VM from one host to another. And it means that there's just a few, typically milliseconds, that the VM doesn't actually get any CPU scheduling. And sometimes there's some applications that just don't handle that gracefully, and the application ultimately crashes. Well, with this new architecture, we can now support notifying the application that it's about to go through a migration process. And if the application vendor has taken advantage of this behavior, it can then do whatever it needs to do from an application perspective to be able to be moved. Right, we generally think about this as affecting voice over IP systems. If you're running a virtualized voice over IP system, digital voicemail systems, those kinds of things. Other applications that are particularly time sensitive, they tend to have failures when you migrate them. So this will give us broader capability to support more types of applications through live migration events with no problems. Again, with the sort of question mark on there of, does the application vendor get on board with this process, and do they write their software to take advantage of this capability from VMware? And then finally here, the last part of the conversation, we're going to move from some of these virtual machine specific enhancements to some things that fit into that second bucket of optimizing money and time. And from the vSphere 8 perspective, that really falls into lifecycle management. One of the things that, if you've ever watched what was previously, of course, Update Manager, and now we think about Lifecycle Manager, if you've watched it through the process, you know it typically puts a host in a maintenance mode and then stages the patches out to the host's hard drive, and then it can run through applying those patches and doing the reboot. But kind of the challenge there was the first step in that process was putting that host into maintenance mode so that we could then stage the patches. Well, with Lifecycle Manager in version 8, we've been able to reverse that process. So we can now stage all of the patches to host before we need to put them into maintenance mode. As you can imagine, that is going to save a substantial amount of time that an individual host has to be in the maintenance mode condition and offline for work. So a simple little change, but it's going to make a huge improvement in our maintenance windows for patching and updating. The second thing that we got that's kind of interesting, and I think it's a really great feature, I wanted to bring it forward. If I'm being completely honest, I don't know that this is going to be all that relevant for the SMB and commercial space. When I think through this, this is probably a feature set that makes more sense for bigger environments. But we now have the ability to patch and reboot more than one host in parallel. And if you've watched this process in previous versions, you know we got one host completely patched and out of maintenance mode before either Update Manager previously or Lifecycle Manager in version 7 would move on to the next host. Well, that's great for resiliency, right? That's ideal because now we only have one host offline for planned maintenance, kind of great. But if you have a large cluster, 30 nodes or more, maybe even 20 nodes or more would classify. You may be in a scenario where you say, yeah, but I can afford to have 2, maybe even 3 nodes down at a time. And if I could do that concurrently, it would make my overall patch time faster. Well, now we can do that. We can, a couple of ways we can do this. You can either specify that the administrator is going to have pre-selected some hosts and already put them into maintenance mode. And so you tell Lifecycle Manager, go patch everything in maintenance mode right now and just get them all done. Or you can point Lifecycle Manager at a cluster and say, you can put a maximum of 3 hosts or a maximum of 6 hosts or whatever is workable for your architecture. A maximum of a given number of hosts into maintenance mode concurrently. And Lifecycle Manager will just go out and pick that number of hosts that you've told it and get busy about doing the patch concurrently against multiple hosts. So figuring out a way to ultimately shorten the overall maintenance windows when we need to do maintenance against our hosts. And then the last one, this is kind of, I don't know how often all of you run into this. This seems to be one that I've kind of bumped into at different times when I was working with customers and doing updates or doing changes. And so the idea here is you're doing a patch of vCenter or you're doing some update, and for whatever reason, something goes wrong. And the reality is today, that's not a huge issue. It's more of an annoyance because with the vCenter backup architectures, all I really have to do is deploy a brand new vCenter virtual appliance VM and then recover the backup data. Not a big deal, unless between when I'd done the backup and when I was trying to do the upgrade that failed, or whatever the maintenance issue that failed, and I wanted to delete the vCenter and start over, if I'd made a cluster change, like adding a host or removing a host from that cluster, the backup that I recover didn't have that information and it was lost. And so then I had to deploy my new vCenter, restore the backup, and then manually reconcile the new vCenter's configuration against what the cluster actually had. Now, one of the really cool things that's happening is when vCenter is managing a cluster, it is also keeping the cluster configuration on the ESX host that it's managing. Basically a backup copy. So now, if I have that scenario where something happens and I lose my vCenter and I say, you know what, whatever, I'm just going to deploy a fresh one and then go get my backup. If there's some discrepancy between the backup and the actual cluster configuration, vCenter can reconcile that for itself because the cluster configuration is kept distributed on the ESXi hosts in the cluster itself. So kind of a scenario that you're not going to need very often, but boy, when it shows up, is it going to be handy. So I see from the chat one, I don't see any open questions. And we are usually down to we've got some questions, but I've got a hand up. So I don't know if there's a question that went into chat, not Q&A. Doesn't look like it.
Yeah, I do see a hand up from Andy. So if there's any questions, please feel free to drop them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Other than that, I think we've reached the end of the presentation. We do have some of the related VMware courses that we offer listed on the next page. And I'll drop a link on the chat so you guys can kind of check out our website to see any of our VMware training courses.
Great question in the chat. So is any of this applicable for VMware on cloud, Azure and AWS? Generally, interesting way I'm going to respond to this. Generally, I'm going to say no. And here's why I say no. When you look at VMC on AWS, Azure, or Google Cloud, that code base that's running in the hyperscalers is actually slightly ahead of the general availability code that you can get and run on premises. I can give you a really concrete example. In the 6.7 days, when they released the update for VMC on AWS, if you checked your code there, you were running vSphere 6.8. Well, vSphere 6.8 was never a version that you could download and consume on premises in your own data centers. But technically, that's what was running up in the cloud. So is this directly applicable to the hyperscalers? I'm going to say no, but the reality is, if you're in the hyperscaler environment, you are probably seeing these features and may have actually been seeing some of these feature sets earlier. So there's the sort of unusual answer. Yes and no, it's applicable to the cloud providers. Absolutely. Any certifications for 8.x? So certifications, right? We got a pretty big revamp on certifications about 4 years ago. VMware no longer ties your certification to the vSphere version, right? Those days are gone. So what you would get today, assuming we're talking about data center virtualization, you would be pursuing the VCP, the VMware Certified Professional, DCV for data center virtualization, and you're going to be pursuing the DCV for 2023. Your certification is now aligned to the year in which you take the exam. Having said that, specifically related to the certification, I did hear, and I have not gone out to Pearson VUE's website specifically, but I did hear that the exam itself has been revved. There is a new exam number, and it is more aligned to some of the version 8 concepts. So, right, no alignment between the cert and the exam and the vSphere version, but I do think we've seen the exam rev based on version 8. Interesting question. Okay, so I said that it might be a good idea to start thinking about speccing in some DPUs in future ESXi hosts. Right? If you're going through a hardware refresh and you have the luxury of being able to maybe build in a DPU card into the future spec, what criteria should you be evaluating? Right? That's a great question. You're going to want to make sure that the DPU feature set aligns to, how do I want to say this? Your architecture priorities, right? I'm actually going to let me jump backward in the slide deck a little bit. We know today the version 8 GA release supports only NSX-based networking and security services. So that's all that VMware is supporting in this. But coming in the future, we know that some of the vSAN, because vSAN is a very network-centric storage tool. So they're going to be adding vSAN services in. And I haven't been able to find much. I don't really know what's coming around host management. But think about this idea of you have a dedicated card in the host that can now do some host level management. And this hypervisor can maybe talk to that hypervisor, right? Because that's the other interesting thing. This is a little like Inception, the movie, right? You now have one physical box that's running two copies of the hypervisor, and they can talk to each other. So maybe it can change some CPU prioritization for a VM or something. I don't know what they're going to do with this yet. I haven't read, but so which DPU you want to select comes down to which ones of these future services do you want to run? If you're thinking about the DPU purely because you want to do NSX firewalling behavior, well, then you go out and you shop for a DPU that is partnered and heavily invested in the NSX security technologies. If your primary use is you're running a vSAN cluster and you really want to make sure that you're optimizing for your vSAN traffic and your vSAN services, make sure you're pursuing DPU hardware that tailors to vSAN, right? Those kinds of things. So which DPU you're going to be considering is going to be all about the priorities in your cluster architecture. Great question. Yeah. So Brian just popped into, by the way, hi, Brian. Yeah, offloading, that's sort of the beautiful part about a DPU, right? It doesn't matter where we're talking about vSAN or we're talking about those NSX security services. Offloading those from your core Intel or AMD CPU, yeah, Brian says it, it's a huge game changer. And like I said, what's really cool about this is if you go read white papers and the architecture papers about what's happening inside of AWS and Google Cloud and Azure Cloud, the hyperscalers have been leveraging these types of dedicated architectures for a long time. And we're now getting the benefit of being able to pull those into our on-premises data centers. Yeah, great question, Anna. Any timeline on when the other features are coming? I haven't seen anything on futures about when things like the vSAN offload and whatever. I don't even know what those host management functions are going to be. I haven't even read like a wish list that they're talking about so far as those things. So unfortunately, no. We just know that the NSX networking and security offload, we have that now, right? That was part of 8 general availability. But I have read nothing on the futures. Yeah, that's a great point, Dave. Dave put in the chat is, even if you're not ready to commit to the investment in the DPU in your next upcoming hardware refresh, make sure that your new servers could support DPUs, because a lot of, right, this is, the DPU is an interesting relationship between the motherboard and this dedicated processor card. And so even if you don't have the budget and think it's not relevant to commit to that budget today to buy the DPU, if you are in a hardware refresh, at least make sure that your new chassis you're buying could support DPUs in the future. Great point, Dave. Thank you. Andy says the changes regarding vNUMA support seem to not be that significant. I would agree. There's functionally no change. Really, the changes in vNUMA are about convenience and the user interface. And I've just always thought it was remarkably tedious to have to go into a VM, set the advanced features, and do all of that. It seemed like something that should have been moved into the UI a while ago, in my opinion. And so it's just kind of nice to see it move, right? Functionally, technically, Andy, no difference. It's all a difference in the UI and how easy, in my opinion, easier to configure vNUMA today. Good point.
All right, and thanks to everyone for dropping in those questions. We have reached the end of the presentation, so Ken and I will stay on for a little while in case there's more questions from the audience. Other than that, thank you all so much for joining. This webinar was recorded, and everyone who registered will receive a recording of the webinar by the end of this week.
Thanks, everybody. Yeah. Andy, you're very welcome. For those of you that are still with us, Brian's got a great point. When you think about the technical underpinnings of what vSAN is doing, then Brian, I'm going to steal your language there. The weird cycles competition curve, which is a great descriptor, right? You get this scenario where you've got a VM that gets very busy about what it's doing, and maybe it's doing some analytics or writing something to a database or whatever it may be. And so now you got this weird cycle where the VM is getting really busy, and that's causing vSAN to get really busy. And now those two things are competing for CPU cycles and potentially network cycles at the same time, depending on what the VM is doing. And now they kind of get this thing where they're competing, they're butting heads for the same physical Intel or AMD CPU resource. And with the ability to, at some point in the future, be able to offload those to a DPU, it just cleans that up so much.
All right, and once again, thank you so much for everyone for joining, and thank you, Ken, for hosting this webinar. All right, have a
Absolutely.
good day, everyone.
Thanks all.